the Whispering Pines. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. 6 friends, a secluded campsite in the heart of the Whispering Pines National Forest, and no cell service for miles. Just nature, laughter, and the crackling of a campfire under a star-filled sky. But what started as an idyllic escape quickly turned into a nightmare none of them would ever forget. The group arrived at the campsite just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine needles filled their lungs as they unloaded their gear. The campsite was remote, tucked away in a clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The park ranger had warned them about the area's eerie reputation. Locals called it the Whispering Pines for a reason, but they brushed it off as superstition. After all, they were city kids, and ghost stories were just that, stories. As they set up their tents, Sarah, the unofficial leader of the group, noticed something strange. The trees seemed to creak and groan more than usual, as if they were alive. She mentioned it to Jake, her boyfriend, but he just laughed it off. "It's the wind, babe. Relax," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. By the time the campfire was roaring, the group was in high spirits. They roasted marshmallows, told jokes, and shared stories about their favorite camping trips. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, as if the animals themselves were holding their breath. Even the fire seemed to dim, its flames flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. That's when they heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. It seemed to come from all directions at once, a low, guttural murmur that sent chills down their spines. They froze, their laughter dying in their throats. "Did you hear that?" Emily, the most skeptical of the group, asked, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Jake said again. But this time, even he didn't sound convinced. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was angry, almost predatory. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. But before anyone could respond, the fire went out. In the pitch-black darkness, panic set in. The group fumbled for their flashlights, but the beams seemed feeble against the oppressive blackness of the forest. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Let's get to the car," Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise. They stumbled through the trees, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they tried to find their way back to the parking lot. But the forest seemed to have shifted, the paths they had taken earlier now unrecognizable. That's when they realized Emily was missing. "Emily!" they called, their voices echoing through the trees. But there was no response, only the relentless whispers that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Hours later, they finally stumbled upon the ranger's station, battered and terrified. The ranger listened to their story with a grim expression. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said quietly. "The Whispering Pines. It's cursed. Decades ago, a group of loggers went missing in those woods. They were never found, but locals say their spirits still haunt the forest, whispering to anyone who dares to camp there." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What about Emily?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The ranger shook his head. "I'm sorry. No one who's gone missing in those woods has ever been found." The group never spoke of that night again. They returned to the city, haunted by the memory of the whispers and the guilt of leaving Emily behind. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would hear it, a faint whisper just like the ones in the forest. And she knew, deep down, that the spirits of the Whispering Pines had followed her home. This story is a chilling reminder that some places are better left unexplored. The Whispering Pines may be beautiful, but they hold secrets that are best left buried. So, the next time you're planning a camping trip, think twice before venturing into the unknown, because you never know what might be waiting for you in the dark. The days following their return from the forest were a blur for Sarah. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time she closed her eyes, She saw Emily's face, heard her voice, and felt the crushing guilt of leaving her behind. The police had launched a search party, but after 3 days they found nothing. No trace of Emily, no clues, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole. Sarah couldn't accept it. She refused to believe that Emily was gone forever. Determined to find answers, she began researching the history of the Whispering Pines. Late one night, she stumbled upon an old newspaper article from the 1930s. The headline read, "Loggers vanish in Whispering Pines Forest. No trace found." The article detailed how a group of 6 loggers had disappeared while working in the forest. Their tools and belongings were found neatly arranged at their campsite, but the men were never seen again. Locals claimed to hear whispers in the woods after their disappearance, and some even reported seeing shadowy figures moving between the trees. The forest was declared cursed, and the area was eventually closed off to the public for decades. Sarah's heart raced as she read the article. The parallels were uncanny: 6 loggers, 6 friends. Was it a coincidence, or was something more sinister at play? She knew she had to go back to the forest, but she couldn't do it alone. Sarah reached out to Jake, but he refused to even consider going back. "Are you insane?" he shouted over the phone. "We barely made it out alive last time. Emily's gone, Sarah. You need to let it go." But Sarah couldn't let it go. She contacted the others, Mark, Lisa, and Chris, but they all gave her the same response. No one wanted to return to the Whispering Pines. Frustrated and desperate, Sarah decided to go alone. She packed her bag with essentials: a flashlight, a knife, a first aid kit, and a voice recorder. She also brought a small jar of salt, a gift from her grandmother who had always believed in the supernatural. "Salt purifies," her grandmother used to say. "It keeps the evil at bay." As she drove back to the forest, Sarah's mind raced with questions. What had happened to Emily? Were the whispers real, or just a trick of the mind? And what had happened to those loggers all those years ago? She didn't have answers, but she was determined to find them. The forest was just as she remembered it: dark, foreboding, and eerily silent. The whispers began almost as soon as she stepped out of her car. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder as she ventured deeper into the woods. Sarah followed the path they had taken that fateful night, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. She tried to ignore the whispers, focusing instead on the task at hand: finding Emily. After hours of searching, Sarah stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold: a makeshift campsite hidden deep within the forest. The tents were tattered and covered in moss, and the fire pit was filled with ash. But what caught her attention was the journal lying on a rotting log. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. It belonged to one of the loggers, a man named Thomas. The entries were filled with accounts of strange occurrences: whispers in the night, shadowy figures, and a growing sense of dread. The final entry was dated the day before the loggers disappeared. Asterisk, "We're not alone out here. The forest, it's alive. It's watching us, waiting. I don't know how much longer we can last. If anyone finds this, tell my family I love them. And whatever you do, stay out of the Whispering Pines." Asterisk. Sarah's heart pounded as she read the words. The forest was alive? What did that mean? Before she could process the information, she heard a noise behind her. A soft, almost imperceptible crunch of leaves. She spun around, her flashlight illuminating the darkness. There, standing between the trees, was Emily. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Emily looked different. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, devoid of life. She was wearing the same clothes she had been wearing the night she disappeared, but they were torn and stained with dirt. "Emily?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Emily didn't respond. She simply stared at Sarah, her expression blank. Then, slowly, she raised her arm and pointed deeper into the forest. Sarah hesitated. She wanted to run to Emily, to grab her and take her home, but something held her back. There was something wrong. something unnatural about the way Emily looked, the way she moved. "Emily, it's me, Sarah," she said, taking a cautious step forward. "We've been looking for you. We need to get out of here." Emily's lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Sarah felt a cold sweat break out on her skin as she realized the truth. This wasn't Emily. Not really. It was something else, something wearing her friend's face. Sarah turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest seemed to come alive around her, the trees twisting and shifting to block her path. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to scream in her ears. She stumbled and fell, her flashlight slipping from her grasp. As she scrambled to her feet, she felt something grab her ankle. A cold, bony hand that seemed to emerge from the ground itself. She kicked frantically, her screams echoing through the forest. Finally, she broke free and ran, her lungs burning as she pushed herself to the limit. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Emily, or what was left of her, standing at the edge of the forest, her hollow eyes watching as Sarah disappeared into the night. Sarah never returned to the Whispering Pines. She tried to move on with her life, but the experience haunted her. She kept the journal, a grim reminder of what she had seen, but she never told anyone about her encounter with Emily. She knew no one would believe her. Years later, Sarah received a package in the mail. Inside was a photograph of the campsite, taken the night they had first arrived. In the background, barely visible among the trees, was a shadowy figure. A figure that looked eerily like Emily. On the back of the photo was a single word, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, help, asterisk. This expanded version of the story adds more depth to the characters, explores the history of the forest, and introduces new elements of horror. If you'd like me to continue expanding it further, I can add more twists, develop the backstory of the loggers, or delve into Sarah's psychological struggle after her encounter. Let me know. Sarah stared at the photograph, her hands trembling. The shadowy figure in the background was unmistakable. Emily, or what was left of her. The word help scrawled on the back sent a chill down her spine. Who had sent this? And why now, after all these years? The package had no return address, only a postmark from a small town near the Whispering Pines. Sarah's mind raced. She had tried to forget about the forest, to bury the memories deep down. But this was a direct message. Someone or something wanted her to go back. She spent the next few days in a haze, unable to focus on anything but the photograph. She found herself obsessing over the details. The way the figure seemed to blend into the trees, the faint glow of its eyes, the unnatural angle of its limbs. It was as if the forest itself had taken Emily and twisted her into something else. Sarah knew she couldn't ignore this. She had to go back, not just for Emily, but for herself. She needed answers, closure, something to silence the whispers that still haunted her dreams. Sarah drove to the small town near the Whispering Pines, a place she had avoided for years. It was a quiet, run-down town, with boarded-up storefronts and a general sense of decay. The locals eyed her with suspicion as she walked into the town's only diner, a dimly lit place with cracked vinyl booths and a flickering neon sign. She ordered a coffee and sat at the counter, trying to gather her thoughts. That's when she noticed him, an old man sitting in the corner, his grizzled face half hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. He was watching her intently, his eyes sharp and calculating. Sarah felt a surge of unease but forced herself to stay calm. She approached the man, holding up the photograph. "Do you know anything about this?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. The man studied the photo for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You're the one who went into the forest," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "I've been waiting for you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Waiting for me? Why?" The man leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Because you're the only one who can stop it." The man introduced himself as Samuel, a former park ranger who had worked in the Whispering Pines for over 30 years. He had seen things, terrible things, that he couldn't explain. He told Sarah about the curse that had plagued the forest for centuries. A curse born of blood and betrayal. Long ago, this land belonged to the Native Americans, Samuel explained. They revered the forest, believed it was sacred. But when the settlers came, they didn't care. They cut down the trees, killed the animals, and desecrated the land. The tribe's shaman cursed the forest, condemning it to eternal darkness. Anyone who enters the Whispering Pines becomes part of it, trapped forever. Sarah listened in stunned silence. "But why me?" she asked. "Why am I the only one who can stop it?" Samuel leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "Because you've been marked. The forest chose you. It wants you to take Emily's place." Samuel told Sarah about a ritual, an ancient practice that could break the curse. It involved finding the heart of the forest, a place where the trees grew in a perfect circle, and performing a ceremony to appease the spirits. But it was dangerous, and many had tried and failed. "You'll need these," Samuel said, handing her a small pouch filled with herbs and a silver dagger. "The herbs will protect you, and the dagger, well, you'll know when to use it." Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to go back into the forest, but she knew she had no choice. If she didn't, the curse would continue to claim lives, and Emily would never be free. Sarah returned to the Whispering Pines, her resolve steeled but her heart pounding. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The whispers began almost immediately, but this time Sarah was prepared. She sprinkled the herbs around her, creating a protective barrier. She followed Samuel's directions, navigating the twisted paths until she found the heart of the forest, a clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle. In the center was a stone altar, covered in moss and carved with strange symbols. Sarah approached the altar, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She placed the dagger on the stone and began the ritual, chanting the words Samuel had taught her. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the forest itself was trying to stop her. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The trees swayed violently, their branches clawing at the sky. Sarah felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, and she turned to see Emily standing behind her, her hollow eyes filled with rage. "You shouldn't have come back," Emily hissed, her voice a guttural growl. Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't falter. She grabbed the dagger and plunged it into the altar, screaming the final words of the ritual. The forest erupted in a blinding light, and Sarah felt herself being pulled into the darkness. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was lying in the clearing, the forest silent and still. The whispers were gone, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. She looked around, but there was no sign of Emily or the altar. She stumbled out of the forest, her body weak and her mind reeling. Samuel was waiting for her at the edge of the trees, his expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "You did it," he said quietly. "The curse is broken." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. She had done it, but at what cost? Emily was gone, and Sarah knew she would carry the scars of that night for the rest of her life. Years later, Sarah returned to the Whispering Pines one last time. The forest was different now, lighter, more alive. The trees no longer seemed to whisper, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart heavy but at peace. As she turned to leave, she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft she almost missed it. "Thank you." Sarah smiled, a single tear rolling down her cheek. She knew it was Emily finally free, and as she walked away, she felt a sense of closure, knowing that the forest and her friend were finally at rest. After breaking the curse, Sarah returned to the small town near the Whispering Pines, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. But the town had changed. The air of decay and suspicion that had hung over it for decades seemed to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. People smiled more, the boarded-up storefronts began to reopen, and the diner where Sarah had first met Samuel was now bustling with life. But not everyone was happy about the curse being broken. Sarah noticed the sideways glances, the hushed whispers when she walked by. Some of the townsfolk seemed almost resentful, as if they had grown accustomed to the darkness and didn't know how to live without it. One evening, as she sat in the diner, a man approached her, a burly, rough-looking figure with a scowl on his face. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you've saved us? You've just made things worse." Sarah stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" The man leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour. "The forest kept things in check. Now that the curse is gone, there's nothing holding it back." Before Sarah could respond, the man stormed out of the diner, leaving her with a sinking feeling in her stomach. What did he mean? What was being held back? Sarah decided to stay in town, partly out of curiosity and partly because she felt a strange sense of responsibility. She rented a small cabin on the edge of the forest, determined to keep an eye on the whispering pines. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to notice strange things. The animals that had returned to the forest after the curse was broken started disappearing again. Hikers reported hearing faint whispers, though they were nothing like the ones Sarah had experienced. And then there were the dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams of the forest calling to her, begging her to return. One night, Sarah woke up to the sound of scratching at her door. She grabbed the silver dagger Samuel had given her. She kept it by her bed now and cautiously approached the door. When she opened it, there was nothing there, but the ground outside was covered in strange, claw-like marks. The next morning, she went to see Samuel. He had retired from his job as a park ranger, but still lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town. When she told him about the scratching and the dreams, his face grew pale. "The curse is broken," he said. "But the forest, it's still alive. It's angry, and it wants revenge." Samuel explained that the curse had been a barrier, keeping the forest's darker forces at bay. With the curse gone, those forces were now free to roam. "The forest was never the problem," he said. "It was the thing living inside it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What thing?" Samuel hesitated, as if afraid to say the words. "The shaman who cursed the forest, he didn't just curse it. He bound something to it, a spirit, a demon, something ancient and evil. The curse kept it trapped, but now," Sarah's mind raced. She had thought the nightmare was over, but it was only just beginning. "What do we do?" she asked. Samuel shook his head. "I don't know, but if we don't stop it, the entire town, maybe even the world, will pay the price." Sarah knew what she had to do. She couldn't let the forest, or whatever was inside it, claim more lives. She gathered her supplies, the silver dagger, the pouch of herbs, and a few other items Samuel had given her. Then she set out for the heart of the forest once more. The journey was harder this time. The forest seemed to resist her, the trees twisting and shifting to block her path. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. But Sarah pressed on, driven by a determination she didn't know she had. When she reached the clearing, she found it changed. The stone altar was gone, replaced by a gaping hole in the ground. From the hole came a low, guttural growl, like the sound of the earth itself groaning in pain. Sarah approached the hole cautiously, her dagger at the ready. As she peered into the darkness, she saw something moving, a shadowy, shapeless mass that seemed to pulse and writhe. It was the thing Samuel had warned her about, the thing that had been bound to the forest. The thing surged out of the hole, its form shifting and changing as it moved. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding, but she didn't run. She raised the dagger and began to chant the words Samuel had taught her, the words of the ritual. The thing roared, a sound that shook the ground and sent birds fleeing from the trees. It lunged at Sarah, but she held her ground, slashing at it with the dagger. The blade seemed to hurt it, but not enough to stop it. Desperate, Sarah reached into the pouch of herbs and threw them at the thing. The herbs burst into flames, engulfing the creature in a fiery blaze. It screamed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and began to shrink, its form collapsing in on itself. But it wasn't enough. The thing was still alive, still fighting. Sarah knew she had to do something more, something drastic. She took a deep breath and plunged the dagger into her own hand, letting her blood drip onto the ground. "I offer myself," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "Take me and leave this place in peace." The thing hesitated, then lunged at her, its form dissolving into a cloud of darkness that enveloped her completely. Sarah felt a cold, suffocating pressure, and then nothing. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was lying in the clearing, the forest silent and still once more. The hole in the ground was gone, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. She looked down at her hand, but there was no wound, no sign of what she had done. She stumbled out of the forest, her body weak and her mind reeling. Samuel was waiting for her at the edge of the trees, his expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "You did it," he said quietly. "It's over." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. She had done it, but at what cost? She had offered herself to the forest, and it had taken something from her. Something she couldn't quite name. Sarah stayed in the town, though she never ventured into the forest again. The townsfolk, once wary of her, now treated her with a kind of reverence. They didn't know what she had done, but they could feel that the darkness was gone. Over time, Sarah began to rebuild her life. She opened a small bookstore in town, a quiet place where people could come to escape the world for a while. But she never forgot the whispering pines, or the price she had paid to save it. And sometimes, late at night, she would hear it, a faint whisper so soft she almost missed it. But this time it wasn't angry or menacing. It was peaceful, almost grateful. "Thank you," it said, and Sarah would smile, knowing that the forest and her friend were finally at rest. It had been several years since Sarah had sacrificed herself to stop the darkness in Whispering Pines. The town was thriving, the forest was safe, and people were beginning to forget about the curse. But Sarah sensed that something was wrong. Her dreams became disturbing. She saw shadows moving between the trees and heard voices calling her back. One morning, she found a strange object on her doorstep, an old, tattered book wrapped in leather. Engraved on the cover were symbols similar to those she had seen on the stone altar. Inside the book were notes written in an unknown language and drawings depicting rituals she had never seen before. Sarah realized that this was no accidental find. Someone wanted her to see this, but who and why? Sarah decided to go to Samuel for help, but found his house empty. The neighbors said he had left weeks ago without saying a word. Left alone, Sarah began studying the book, trying to decipher its contents. She contacted a local historian, an elderly man named Henry, who specialized in the folklore and legends of the region. Henry was fascinated by the book. He said it could be the diary of a shaman who cursed the forest. If so, it might hold clues to understanding what really happened in Whispering Pines and what might happen in the future. But Henry warned Sarah, "Some knowledge is best left alone. Are you sure you want to find out?" As Sarah and Henry deciphered the book, they discovered that the curse was only part of something bigger. The shaman hadn't just bound darkness to the forest. He'd made a deal with an ancient spirit to protect his land from invaders. But the spirit proved insidious, and its power grew with each passing year, feeding off the fear and suffering of those who entered the forest. Now that the curse had been lifted, the spirit was free, but not destroyed. It waited, gaining strength to return. Sarah realized that her sacrifice was only a temporary solution. To stop the spirit once and for all, she needed to find a way to destroy its source, the ancient artifact the shaman had used to seal the deal. Sarah and Henry began their search for the artifact, following the clues in the book. Their path led them to an abandoned village deep in the mountains. A tribe of shaman had once lived here, but now the place was desolate and gloomy. In the center of the village, they found an ancient temple hidden under layers of earth and moss. Inside the temple was an artifact, a stone idol modeled with the same symbols as the book. But when Sarah tried to take it, the temple began to crumble and figures emerged from the shadows. The ghosts of those who had died in the forest, including Emily. "You can't take him," Emily whispered. "He belongs to him." Sarah realized that the spirit was using the artifact to hold the souls of the dead captive. To free them and destroy the spirit, she needed to smash the idol. But that required performing a ritual that could cost her her life. Henry offered to help, but Sarah knew it was her way. She took the silver dagger, which still bore traces of her blood, and began the ritual. The spirits surrounded her, their whispers merging into one rumbling voice, but Sarah did not give up. When she struck the idol with the dagger, the temple filled with light. The spirits screamed, their forms dissolving into thin air. The idol split open, and the darkness that had been bound to it vanished. Sarah woke up outside the temple. Henry bent over her. The temple had been destroyed and the artifact had been destroyed. The forest around them seemed calm, as if it had finally found peace. When they returned to the city, Sarah sensed that something had changed. The shadows that had haunted her were gone. She knew that the spirit had been defeated and the souls of the dead had been released. But Sarah also knew that her journey was not over. The world was full of mysteries, and she was ready to explore them, not as a victim, but as a protector.